Good afternoon. It's Tuesday, the 15th of December 2015, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Brian Gerrish. With me in the studio, Mike Robinson, deep behind the technical desk, and we're going to be joined by live video Skype link from Holland by Alex Thompson from Eastern Approaches. Well, first of all, as we always do, the weather. Pretty grey, gloomy, cold, damp in Plymouth. The reports are pretty similar from Wales. We've got bucketing down in Pembrokeshire and overcast in Rhondda. And Manchester is just looking a bit dark and gloomy. But of course, we shouldn't be worried about the weather. We certainly shouldn't be worried about climate change, although perhaps there's a few posters on the continent trying to persuade us we should be very frightened. More of that later. What we should be concentrating is the dark and very dirty deeds of our own politicians. Mike, over to you.
Well, the question is this a follow-up from the type of activity that was going on with Brooks Newmark in 2013? So here we've got Tobias Ellwood MP, who many people won't know is the Middle East minister. And he is over visiting the Iraqi foreign minister at the moment. And, well, of course, everybody knows that Iraq are pretty unhappy with the fact that Turkish troops crossing their borders, US sending troops over. In fact, if you look on the Zero Hedge website, they have published an article really highlighting what's going on because they're asking the question, does the US have a secret non-negotiable plan to send 100,000 US Saudi troops to Iraq? And they're talking about a coalition involving troops from the US, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and United Arab Emirates. They point out that RT has quite a bit about this. I'll just quote a bit from the RT article. It says, during a meeting in Baghdad on November the 27th, this is Senator McCain, told the Prime Minister of Iraq that a number of senior Iraqi cabinet and military officials that a decision had been made which was non-negotiable. And this was claimed by the head of the opposition movement in Iraq. She said that 100,000 foreign troops, including 80,000 from Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar and Jordan, and 10,000 troops from America will be deployed in the western regions of Iraq. So with Turkey on one side of Syria and 100,000 coalition troops of a form on the other side in Iraq, and of course, let's not forget Israel itself. It looks like the Greater Israel Project has just shifted into a higher gear. And as I was pointing out last week, with MP rhetoric in the UK full of these borders are artificial constructs anyway, and alongside the mainstream articles over the last couple of weeks informing us that ISIS has a constitution and that and ISIS also has tax raising powers, we can see where this is heading. So the question is, will Russia stand by and allow it to happen? I wouldn't think so, Brian.
I wouldn't think so either, but perhaps Alex is the man to bring in on this one. What are your thoughts, Alex?
The Russians take a multi-generational view of European security. In fact, so do the Chinese, for all that they're not even in Europe. It seems to be only the Europeans that think that politics is a matter for the here and now, or in that famous phrase that a week is a long time in politics. You won't hear such talk from a Russian. So no, I don't think the Russians will stand for that because they're thinking about the next century or two.
It is remarkable, the constant meddling, isn't it, by UK, well, of course, USA as well, but we'll stick with Britain. No country in the world, it seems, is safe from advice and meddling by British politicians. Do you think there's some significance with the fact that it's Mr. Ellwood who's the man who's now doing this?
To be frank, I'd never heard of Mr. Ellwood. I'm seeing a couple of people talking about him in the chat box here. But the more obscure the gentleman pursuing a British policy aim, the likelier it is that interests are at stake. And before people pounce on me, I'm not meaning Jewish as a code word for interests. I mean interest in the broadest financial and geopolitical sense. I think that the further east you go, well, I don't think it, I know it because I've travelled. The further east you go, the more Britain has its old-fashioned cachet of perfidious Albion. Okay, it was the French who invented that epithet for us, but if you go as far as Persia, Iran these days, or Russia, or India, then Britain is just a byword for meddling where it doesn't belong.
Right. Well, I suppose we should say at least Mr. Elwood has his clothes on while he's doing his diplomacy overseas. So perhaps he beats Brooks Newmark in that respect. Might take us on to Mr. Putin. He's coming out with some very interesting policy in Russia, which we could do with a bit of the same here, I think.
Yeah, I'm demanding Putin for Prime Minister. Get rid of Cameron. So he's giving the Russian constitution priority over international court rulings. And this is really an attack on the European Court of Human Rights. So he signed into law a bill, according to RT here, which allows the Constitutional Court to overrule the decisions of international courts if such decisions contradict the principle of supremacy of the Russian constitution. That is something that you'll never see happening in this country in these days. And as I say, it's particularly with the European Court of Human Rights in mind. Of course, Russia not part of the European community, but nonetheless, there have been some European court rulings which the Russian Constitutional Court felt it had to step in and say these do not take precedence over constitutional court rulings. So that has now been signed into law in Russia, and he at least protecting his nation's sovereignty, unlike our own elected leader, if that's what he is.
I'll ask you a question, Mike. Do you think that Putin is seeing right through this globalist agenda that's coming in?
I think a lot of people worry a lot about things that are said or comments that are made, but it's what people do that counts, and I just see Putin protecting his interests at every opportunity.
Right. Well, bearing in mind what Mr. Putin's done in the background, let's come back onto the subject of Justin Welby, Archbishop of Canterbury. And of course, we had exposed that he was busy participating in a study which was to do with religion and beliefs in public life. Well, actually, he'd been part of the organisation which had commissioned it. But we were also pointed at this clip from the Ecumenical News, Justin Welby embarrassed about the Church of England pay being below the minimum rate. So here we have Mr. Welby with with that, Mark Carnage is the only name I can remember, which of course is Mark's description for Mark Carney. We got there in the end. And Mrs. Lagarde as well, and I think the chief executive of a very big hedge fund. I'm afraid I can't remember the other gentleman's name. But there's something about this picture. Mr. Welby seems remarkably comfortable with these very, very, very high wealth individuals. He's certainly not turning over the tables of the money lenders. It's almost as though he's enjoying hobnobbing with the people who are at liberty to create money from nothing. But the key bit of the point here is that, of course, when we exposed just who Mr. Welby was working with, it brought us back to none other than George Soros. So we have a decision being made on the position of Christianity in UK. We have comments being made that Christianity should step back. Britain's no longer a Christian country. And we should also change our constitution to reflect this. Who's driving the policy? Well, in the background, we've got Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and George Soros. This is exactly the sort of interference which President Putin seems to be protecting against. Alex, any comments on this one? Because I know you're interested in matters to do with the church and Mr. Welby, probably.
You know, Brian, the key to understanding Welby is his university background. Now, I'm sorry to say that I share the same origins as him spiritually, which is Cambridge Intercollegiate Christian Union, or CICU is the acronym, CICCU, which is the Christian Student Union at Cambridge University. And for the first half of my undergrad career, it seemed that I was destined by Anglican powers that be to be shaped in this kind of vicar factory that eventually churned out the likes of Welby. But they seem to have decided in the end that I wasn't biddable and malleable enough for them. Well, CICU is the oldest Christian student union in the world. It was founded in 1877, and it has a sterling history in sending out missionary bishops and what have you. But I'm afraid in the latter years, it seems to have become, my personal experience and that of many of my friends, is that it churns out a particular mould of not very original and not very daring ministers. who are catapulted into the wealthier parishes of the Church of England, the stockbroker belt of churches, largely in Surrey and also the ones in South Manchester, from where they become Anglican authorities, really. It's about controlling the funds channeled into the Church of England by the larger evangelical congregations and making sure that those men end up at the top. There is, as you pointed out, Brian, a surprising amount of ease and comfort with wealthy men in KICU, and that really, if you're not careful, shapes the rest of your Christian life, this attitude that you need to rub shoulders with the wealthy instead of denouncing them.
Right. Well, I was amused reading that article that the main topic was what the hourly rate was for people working for the Anglican Church. And I think even in central London, it was £6.75 an hour or something like that. So there's no talk about the massive international fraud of the banks, money creation, putting all the African nations into debt. There's nothing about that. It's just almost as though he went and had a few glasses of champagne with those people and they told him off because he wasn't paying people in the church enough. But I did read the article quite quickly, so I may have missed something. Well, Guido Fawkes is also on a similar trail, not to do with Justin Welby, but the fact that he's worked out that everything to do with the forthcoming in or out vote on the EU is being fixed. And he's picked up IPPR here, who he's discovered are busy pushing all matters EU, claiming they're independent, of course, but accepting funding from EU. So here is IPPR's website. It says it's the UK's leading progressive think tank, and the important words, we're an independent registered charity. Just make sure people can see it's their own words. But what has actually been going on, if we can bring it in, should be coming here. Here we are. They've actually received, about £150,000 from the EU. But when Guido Fawkes called them up and said, are you funded by the EU? They initially said no, till he pointed out they were, and then they started to bluster. Alex, these people know perfectly well what they're doing, and this effectively, to my mind, is subversion by the EU, because you are damaging a country's constitution, you're interfering politically, but you're doing it from the shadows. It's a hidden hand. This should be treasonable, shouldn't it?
It certainly should, Brian. And if you read a book called The Great Deception by Booker and North, The Great Deception, readily available for not very much money now, you will find that there is now a century of history of the EU and its predecessors doing this. The great mistake we often make, because the EU wants us to make it, is the assumption that the EU rose from the embers of the Second World War. No, that's the EU's own version of history. It was planned by a duo, Monet, Jean Monnet, the Frenchman, the brandy seller who did some dodgy dealings, who's well known and who's celebrated as a founding god and father of Europe, but also an English civil servant of the 1920s called Arthur Salter. And they actually planned. It often happens this way, that the first generation of a plot is quite open about what they want to do, and later it goes underground. Monet and Salter actually wrote in the 1920s that they would need to subvert national governments and keep them in place while they were building the superstructure of the European federal state. Read The Great Deception by Booker and North.
Okay, well, people do need to read that book. And in fact, I think as this referendum nears, we need to bring out more very good documentation and research that's been done by a number of people over a great many years, warning, of course, that the EU is a fraud. Christopher Story's book, which warns nation states in the EU. The EU, collective enemy of its member states, is another excellent analysis, absolutely warning the EU as a dangerous political entity. Well, it's an EU referendum psyop, Mike, I think.
Well, I just wanted to highlight this article. I'm not going to say very much about it other than just to take interest at the graph, the green line showing people that would like to stay within the European Union, and the red line showing people that want to leave. Whether you believe this or not really depends on how much credence you put on the average poll. But nonetheless, it's interesting that they're saying it's a 50-50 split at the moment. Although you notice that the 50-50 split is actually 20% of the electorate on each side. So, isn't that, sorry, that's 40% of the electorate on each side. So that's, there must be 20% of people in the undecided camp then, according to this particular poll. But nonetheless, a number of articles in the Telegraph today on this issue, MPs coming out and saying that Cameron, in order to take us out of the European Union, would have to renegotiate treaties, and that there's absolutely no possibility of that happening before the vote at the end of 2017. But now that they've decided to hold that vote, they've passed, the bill has passed. They will. They are on a clock now to try to get things in place. But as we've said on many occasions, there is no intention to bring Britain out of the EU. There is no intention to sort of defederalise the EU. Quite the opposite, with more closely tied federal organisations within the EU, including the EU Army.
Mike, I've got to say, my personal opinion is those statistics, the whole thing is a scam to lead people to believe that it's very close. That's not what I pick up by talking to people. I've yet to meet anybody, we'll certainly say outside of London, that seems to like the EU. There's an inbuilt hatred of it. These polls, I think, are just simply created in order to steer public opinion. Alex, what's the view in Europe at the moment? How does Europe see the forthcoming referendum? Do they think that it's 50-50, or is the European opinion that it's the British are going to say no?
The first thing I'd say, Brian, is that the average citizen of a continental country isn't so much as aware that there is going to be a British referendum, because their national newspapers and TV channels don't see fit to tell them. Now, there's a couple of exceptions. The more Eurosceptic countries, the Netherlands here and Denmark, for example, do have press articles about it. And because they are mercantile countries like Britain, their attitude is, well, jolly good for the Brits, we hope they get a good settlement. But I'm afraid that tends to be overridden by this professional Mandarin class. In all the TV channels, the newspapers, even niche newspapers like the serious Roman Catholic papers and the serious Protestant papers, which the Netherlands still has, there might be individual journalists who think that the British have got a raw deal and should either get out or renegotiate. But then what eventually becomes the editorial line is one of these hackneyed arguments that Britain gets far more back than it puts in. And seriously, that's what the Continentals often believe. I had a Bavarian flatmate when I lived in the former Soviet Union 15 years ago, and I told him, because I was of the same opinion even then, that the EU was a giant scam, and he was genuinely befuddled by that opinion. He said, but surely Britain is getting money out of the EU. And I said, no, Britain is the second biggest net contributor after your own dear land of Germany. He couldn't believe it. He'd been brought up all his life by German public institutions to believe that only Germany was a net contributor, and that all the other member states other than Germany were sucking money out of it. So that's a clue. That's the kind of mentality that the continental elite would like to keep their people having. But I'm afraid these days, with cross-border communication, subtitling of YouTube videos, and visits to the continent by Daniel Hannan, Nigel Farage, and many more, this deception won't go on much longer. People will realise that the British do want to get out.
Alex, thank you for that. Remarkable, though, isn't it, that effectively here in UK we are censored. News coming out of Europe, much of it is censored. We only hear the sort of sound bites that the BBC wants us to hear and see. We don't see anything of trouble on the streets. German problems with immigration at the moment. And you're saying, well, it's actually censored back the other way, because you don't want to tell the Europeans too much about what the feeling on the ground in UK is, because this could upset the apple cart as far as the European project. This is political manipulation, isn't it? Yes, and in order to manipulate people politically, you need to have your placemen and placewomen in place. If you look at the history or the personal histories of any journalist of any reputation,
whether it's in Britain or on the continent, you will find that more often than not, they have done a placement, usually known in French as a stage, spelt like stage, with a European institution, or that they were nobbled at student age through an Erasmus exchange, or by marrying someone they met there, or what have you, getting shacked up with someone of another nationality. They've all been sucked into this idea that the project is greater than the national interest. And they are going to be cautious and cagey about how they put that to their own people in the course of their journalistic career. But there's very, very few unsullied journalists in any European country who owe nothing to the EU and any of its tentacles.
Okay. Well, we just have a quick advert here for Mr. Crane, and then we'll move on through the news.
So we are doing a Crane report tonight, Humanity versus Insanity. Ian's going to be joined by Willem Velderhof. He is running a conference in Amsterdam this weekend, but more to the point, he is a pilot. He's with a major national airline. So the subject for tonight is geoengineering. And I think everybody will find that very interesting. 7:30 ukcolumn.org/live.
Okay, and well done, Ian, who's having a few problems at the moment, but is still out there campaigning as hard as he can. So we're going to say thank you, Ian, very much. How are things being done in UK? One of the things that UK Column has continually been warning about is basically the use of NLP, neuro-linguistic programming. This is the Conservative government so-called nudge programme, the Behavioural Insights team. But language can often be a key indicator that something is wrong in our local authorities. And thank you very much to our viewer that sent us through this one. It's from Norfolk County Council. And the key bit is simply the title, Our Plans, Reimagining Norfolk. And if you work your way through this documentation, what you see is that Norfolk County Council, it's not focused on the day-to-day problems that it needs to deal with in order to assist people and repair the roads, get those potholes fixed. The whole of the council has moved into the movement into the new society, the transformation, and everything is going to be reimagined. And I think our viewer picked this up very accurately, that this was manipulation of the way people are thinking, the change in their language, and ultimately that's leading on to a change of behaviour, which is very, very dangerous. And in particular for this Norfolk one, of course, this is moving across to do with child protection. And we'll discuss it more in the new year, but it's quite clear to us that the whole of the child protection system is to be privatised, which will put the safety of children in the hands of people totally and utterly unaccountable to the general public. Well, probably Demos, Mike, is one of the agencies that's been at the forefront of manipulating public opinion from behind the scenes.
Well, indeed. And of course, devolution agenda, one of their key agenda points. So that's moving on apace in the UK. Demos been front and centre of that for many years, and today they produced this report, a new report, Talk of the Town. And they say the Talk of the Town report was undertaken to map the fortunes of the satellite towns orbiting 21, by coincidence, 21 of England's largest cities, and to better understand their distinct characteristics with cross-party agreement, the need for more balanced level of regional economic growth throughout the UK. The report seeks to capture the unique local profiles and needs of both towns and cities and identify where they could most benefit from targeted support. So in other words, Demos has produced a report which identifies where resources need to be targeted in order to move the devolution agenda forward. They're going to say the idea that much needed economic growth will be secured at the regional level enjoys widespread cross-party consensus. Yet a growing body of evidence suggests that while resources are ploughed into UK cities, the satellite towns which surround them may not reap the benefits. Some evidence points to towns being marginalised, missing out, for example, on investments such as the planned high-speed railway HS 2.1. Where towns reach the headlines, it is all too often for the wrong reasons, either as the sites of specific incidents or crimes, or a connection with a host of poor social and economic outcomes ranging from poor quality housing to high levels of unemployment, and so on it goes. And then they say the aim of this report is to contribute to a better understanding of the distinct place towns occupy or should occupy in the move to improve social and economic outcomes. To this end, we have directly compared for the first time how UK towns are faring compared with their neighbouring cities across a range of domains with housing, with health to housing and the built environment. So as I say, that's 21 of England's largest cities. So I also said this was devolution agenda, and of course I meant Agenda 21. Did I say Agenda 21? I could have meant Agenda 2030. I don't think it really makes any difference what this is called. It's all the same policy agenda. And they end up by saying, we hope to have made the case in this short report for the value of considering towns as distinct entities with their own challenges, but also their own assets in the drive to improve social and economic outcomes across Britain. So Demos also intending to drive change in this country, devolution in this country, make sure that resources are targeted for the greater agenda. Brian?
Absolutely, and of course we remember that Demos closely linked to Common Purpose through Julia Middleton, the chief executive of Common Purpose. Demos, with its Marxist origins, now sitting in the background as another independent think tank pushing out policy, and we know where that policy is going. And I think it's significant that in '68, Demos produced a pamphlet about the... you can leave that one on screen actually, Mike, because it was Demos that produced a pamphlet that was talking about the privatisation of the NHS way back in 1968.
Yes, and so that attack on healthcare continues, again under the devolution umbrella. London Deal paves the way to transform health across the capital. So this is groundbreaking plans, according to the government, which will set in motion the radical transformation of health and social care services across London. These were revealed today by George Osborne and Jeremy Hunt. And they say that outlining the first steps towards reshaping healthcare across London, the Chancellor signed a health devolution agreement with the capital's health and civic leaders, which will allow them to begin the process of taking control of their own affairs. And they produced a health devolution agreement, and it begins by saying the London partners' groundbreaking plans for transforming health and care provision across the capital are strongly supported by the government and national health system bodies. And the health devolution agreement doesn't actually define who the London partners are. Now, in the original press release, it does say something about them. It says that the London partners include, the key word here is include, all of London's clinical commissioning groups, local authorities, Greater London Authority and national bodies, including NHS England, Health Education England, NHS Improvement and Public Health England. So my question is, who else does it include? Because they don't say who else it includes. They don't say that this is it. It includes that group of people. So who else does it include? And really what they're talking about here is a bunch of pilot projects, which could very well lead to various forms of privatization. And for example, one of the areas that we know that they're looking at privatizing, Brian, is real estate. And so the North Central London, which is Barnet, Camden, Enfield, Haringey and Islington, they're going to run an estates pilot to test new approaches to collaboration on asset use. Why would they be doing that if not to free up assets for sale?
Well, Mike, I had a very interesting meeting with a lady the other day, very well informed on the NHS. Her opinion was the privatisation is virtually complete. It's there under the surface. She said that when they finally pull the switch, it will only be a few of the best hospitals which will be the privatised ones, and all the rest of the hospitals will be demolished and the infrastructure sold off. So I think we can see this coming through. Should we be surprised? Of course, we've warned about Mr. Oliver Letwin in the Cabinet Office. I was told a few days ago, I haven't got my hands on a copy yet, but apparently he wrote a book which was privatising the world, which would seem pretty topical for a man, of course, working in the shadows to at least privatise UK. So dangerous stuff. And the police also under attack at the moment, although we wouldn't believe it. HMIC, Inspector of Constabulary, has been producing its latest reports. These are police effectiveness in 2015. And the first tranche, as they say, is looking at how the police deal with vulnerable groups. That's children and vulnerable people and survivors of abuse. And according to Zoe Billingham, Thames Valley Police have done exceptionally well. So the report has had a good look into Thames Valley Police. Remember, this was the police force that simply failed to investigate the abuse of youngsters at Oxford and Cherwell Valley College and was responsible for pressure, harassment of the very brave Asian gentleman that actually warned of that abuse going on. Well, how does Zoe rate Thames Valley? Well, they've had a good look, apparently. We're not sure about Oxford and Cherwell Valley College, but the good news is that Thames Valley Police has got a good. They are very effective at protecting from harm those who are vulnerable and supporting victims. Well, that, of course, is the ones that they choose to investigate. The other victims are gently pushed to one side. So we've sent Zoe an email saying, was Oxford and Cherwell Valley College, was that abuse included in her assessment? And we are busy waiting for a response. But this lady has come under criticism by other police forces, in particular Bedfordshire, because they've said to her, you're busy criticising us for what we can do when, of course, the government is subjecting us to massive cuts. So we haven't got the frontline officers in order to carry out the job. And I have to say I've got some sympathy for that. But would this lady have any experience anyway? She's a solicitor and she's been inspecting the police for 10 years, but I'm sure she's extremely knowledgeable. We will see once we get her report on Thames Valley. Well, Alex, let's bring you in properly to give the European perspective. It's hotting up in France with the Le Pen family.
France is socially very different from Britain, and increasingly this can no longer be brushed under the carpet. We talked earlier in this programme about how the respective establishments of journalism on Britain on the continent want to preserve the fiction of great differences and a great divide. But we now have intelligent journalism reaching us from France about who is voting for Marine Le Pen. I've covered in the previous couple of weeks how the National Front in France has been surging in the polls, particularly the last regional elections. Now, surprise, surprise, the inner city inhabitants of Paris and Marseille, largely Muslims in some quarters, have actually been turning to the National Front. Surely that is a no-no. It's unthinkable if you just read establishment journalism, because the National Front is a bunch of bigots and racists, no? Well, actually, it doesn't appear to be the case. The Muslim voters of the French cities have told some journalists that Hollande and his previous supposedly right-wing, his predecessor Sarkozy, are a pair of clones and they never change anything. And they say to the journalists, left and right have failed us. We'd like to see Marine Le Pen in the Élysée, the French presidential palace. Perhaps she'll do something to improve our lives. They have failed. Here's a bit of the article then. The governing Socialist Party has helped to drive some French Muslims into the arms of Marine Le Pen. Firstly, their legalization of same-sex marriage in 2013 angered many Muslims, and the leader of the Front National has promised she will repeal the law if she becomes president in 2017. So there's the first fiction busted, the fiction that Britain is Christian and France is secular. Well, on paper maybe, but what British party is promising to repeal recent tinkering with marriage? Then, says the Spectator, there is the unemployment, the crime and drug gangs that blight many of France's more deprived suburbs, turning some into virtual no-go areas for police and leaving many law-abiding Muslims feeling trapped and abandoned. And I think that in every European country, insufficient attention is paid to the fact that Muslims are about the most law-abiding people you'll find. According to a local community worker in Saint-Denis, which is the part of Paris where the riots happen and where the supposed terrorist sympathy is, a number of elderly residents in the Muslim community have thrown in their lot with the National Front. At first, says the social worker in an interview with Le Parisien, I thought they were being ironic. But no, they're serious. They've had enough of the noise and the insecurity. 10 years ago, these type of comments would have been unimaginable. The import of Muslims was obviously designed for cheap labour, and to the extent that there was a long-term plot or machination behind it, it was the idea of rubbing the noses of the national populations in diversity, as we heard a British politician say recently. But actually it's failed, because what Britain has, or France has done, but also Britain, is import very large numbers of God-fearing, law-abiding people who are not going to put up with the demoralisation of the country.
This is quite remarkable, isn't it? As you talked us through that, my mind was saying yes, and of course we can remember that the BNP was also attracting people from across the spectrum of communities in the UK. I'm sure that's still the case. Never reported by the BBC or the mainstream press, but certainly. Second generation immigrant communities who were beginning to say, well, there's some sense being talked here. So this situation is a lot different from the black and white view that certainly the BBC gives. Mr. Juncker's coming under pressure on the subject of migration, though.
Yes. Do you remember back in September we were told that Britain was the odd one out, and every continental country wanted a fair share system for migrants? That was pretty much what was being said in September, wasn't it?
Indeed.
Now, it turns out that there are very few countries in the European Union that actually support the scheme that Juncker cobbled together. What we see in this is that he's accountable to no one, and he rides roughshod over national governments. We see in the article here, you've got it on screen, the feeble response, that is basically the refusal of member states to take in immigrants as per the quota scheme that was imposed in a hurry. That response is a source of embarrassment for Juncker's European Commission, and a source of quiet satisfaction to Eastern European states, which insisted the plans would not work and protested that they were an unacceptable infringement of sovereignty. Sovereignty is a term that only Poland and Hungary seem to use in the European Union now. Britain doesn't use it very much anymore. But you see that there are many other states that quietly hide behind the positions of these front runners, Poland and Hungary, and are quite glad to see these schemes disappear. Now, Matthew Hullhouse, the Telegraph's Brussels correspondent, who I recently criticised, but he seems to be warming to his job, has got some good sources here. And he writes, one Eastern European diplomat said, quote, Juncker should be fired. He rammed the scheme through, it fails, and then he blames the member states. If you told me a year ago that Juncker would destroy Europe so badly, I would not have believed you, said the Eastern European diplomat. They joined to preserve their sovereignty against future Nazi or Soviet-type invasions, and what have they found? That they've bled their sovereignty for no good. The European diplomat talking to Hullhouse goes on, it's as if there's a burst pipe in the building, and instead of fixing it, Juncker orders all the neighbours to take some of the water into their own houses. I think that's a very good analogy. And another said to Hullhouse, the figures are telling. The targets for migrants to be taken on by EU countries are in the thousands, and the movements, the actual people who move, are in the units. The scheme was too ambitious and rushed. People are even refusing to go to Luxembourg. So I can only imagine the difficulty of getting them to go to Latvia, for example. It hasn't worked, said another senior diplomat from a refusenic state, and if my minister was here, he would tell you I was right. This diplomat said that the divisive policy had pitted Germany and the European Commission, notice the pairing of the two there, they have the same agenda, against members of the former Eastern Bloc, that is, the victims of Germany's multi-generational resource scam. Another Brussels diplomat, this is the end of Hullhouse's article, laughed at the suggestion that this affair might force resignations. Ho ho, it really doesn't work like that here, the diplomat said.
It's absolutely fascinating to hear you reel this stuff off, Alex, because, of course, we're getting a glimpse into a whole area that we can't see by watching mainstream news in in Britain or reading the papers. And I've got to say that we've had a very good response to your reports from inside the belly of the beast, as it were. No disrespect to the Dutch. So please keep going. On the subject of Holland and something I've labelled it, welcome to the EU superstate and double Dutch requirements. You had a bit of an event with, if I've got this correct, trying to prove that you spoke Dutch. Is that right?
Yes. If you come to the Netherlands, bear in mind that this is an experience foreign to British and Irish people. The first thing you do when you arrive on the continent is arrive in your local municipality. That is your local council. In some countries, it's called the commune, which makes it pretty clear what's going on. But in the more civilized ones, it tends to be more veneered, and it's called a municipality. You queue up there for permission to come and move to that city or that region. That duly acquired, you go into the system and you are then in the population register. Britain allegedly doesn't have one, but I'm increasingly skeptical about that because they do seem to be able to track people. Now, you then wait to hear letters from the council. You might get called up for the draft. You might get pinged for extra tax or whatever it might be. You might get a letter telling you that your organs are going to be given to other people unless you say no. All these things happen once you're on a population register. Vaccination obligations, although less in the Netherlands because there's Christians who refuse it. Insurance obligations, ditto. Now, in this case, what happens is if you're a foreign citizen, you have to undergo an equivalent of the Life in the UK training, which the Netherlands has as well. There is an exemption if you can prove you already speak fluent Dutch. And so I responded to the council saying, I do actually speak Dutch. You should have proof of that. I said, because I've come several years ago. Oh, yes, they said, when you were registered, you didn't actually provide a proper birth certificate. You provided an original birth certificate, and that is no good because we want a recent copy, because on the continent, they assume that the most authoritative copy of a document is one recently given because it comes straight from central records, never mind if it's original. So you're certainly not believed, and original documents are no good. It's what the government says about you on the moment, at the moment of issue that matters. So, okay, prove you're born. So I go and get my British birth certificate, a recent copy from the register office there. I have to get an apostille on the back, which is a document agreed in the 1960s, a kind of a stamp on the back, which says this is a real document from a country. And the Dutch accepted that. So, okay, now we accept you're born. You were born. But what about speaking Dutch? Well, that's no problem, I said. I can prove that because I have a postgraduate diploma in Dutch interpreting. It's from Belgium, the country next door, so I used to have no problem with that. Do you have arrows at this point to show what's going on?
I do. Let's bring in the first one on the screen. You'll have to give me the nod to move through. So this was the first bit. The Dutch requirement proved why you should be exempt from a Life in the Netherlands course. And as you've said, you're exempt if you can prove that you speak Dutch. So the Dutch requirement is, first of all, you've got to prove that you were born, and that's the birth certificate there. And where does that go? Now prove that you can speak Dutch. You've come back on to that one.
Yes, and we'll keep the arrows on slides while I talk through this. So I've now told them that I have a a foreign country diploma in Dutch from the country next door. The Dutch and the Flemish, who are half of Belgium, actually have educational cooperation on Dutch language matters. So they're very closely connected. And there's also, within the EU, there's an arrangement called Benelux, of course, which means that they effectively respect each other's documents. However, apostilles are required. So these stamps, and this sets me thinking, the United States consists of 50 states. And if you move from Montana to Maine, your driving license, driver's license, as they say in the States, is respected. So is your educational qualification and so on. There's no reason why the EU couldn't function the same way, because you just need to give people a list, as they do in state offices in the US, of how the other states' documents look. But no, we have to preserve the fiction that these are foreign countries to each other to keep the European peoples happy. So the apostilles, they also provide a nice earner, of course, to the people who stamp and sign. So I then go off to Belgium, and I front up at the Federal Belgian Office, which gives you these apostilles. There's one office per country. In Britain, we have one in Milton Keynes, a spin-off of the Foreign Commonwealth Office. And I do as I've been told on the website, which is I go there with my documents, prepared to pay my €40, and I get there just before closing time on a Friday, which is noon. They only do mornings. And the first thing I asked the gentleman is, what are your opening times? He said, until New Year, mate, it's 9 to 12. After that, it's anybody's guess. I said, it's just before 12, so I'm in time, aren't I, to get these documents apostilled? He takes one cursory glance at them and says, no, these are Flemish documents. The community of Flanders has to prove that these documents exist first. So that means I have to wait the weekend and troop off the following Monday morning to the Community of Flanders Ministry. And what a revelation. Instead of a dingy building, this is a building that actually belongs to a people group. That's the crucial difference. Belongs to a cohesive group called the Flemish, who would otherwise be a nation if they weren't in Belgium. And so it's a brand spanking new building. Well, actually 17 years old when I asked, but it looked as good as new because it's well maintained. It's a rarity in Brussels. It's actually someone's responsibility, you see this building, sitting there beside the Gare du Nord. And I go in there, and what's the difference? Instead of paying €40, it's free. I'm shepherded upstairs by very smiling, friendly ladies. In the lift, they're playing Germanic folk music, cheerful kind of parum-pa-pum music, which reinforces the impression, aren't we glad to be Flemish? Isn't it nice? And I step out, very cordially received. And the lady who does the legalization is training two young ladies not long out of college. And she says, now, girls, this is what we do. We look at the signature. Fine, all in order, signed, stamped. There you go, Mr. Thompson. Have a nice day. And that's not the end of it. I then have to go back to the federal Belgian office where I'd been sent on Friday to say, here's my document. I then noticed, because it's much more crowded than the Friday, that the place is full of poor Arabs and Africans being treated abominably. And, in Britain, at least, we still have the decency to talk to people nicely at a government office even. But here people are being told, stay behind that line. No, go away. You're at the wrong place. Go now. The security guards are G4S at this place. They're behaving as though they were employees of the federal government. Then I noticed I can't pay cash because there's a big sign on the wall saying the Kingdom no longer accepts cash since the 1st of July. It's not legal tender. The euro cash is not legal tender for proper debts to the Kingdom of Belgium. Finally, I wait my turn and I get my stamp. Then I have to trot back to the Netherlands, which I haven't done yet, and I have to submit that to my city council. And it's up to His Gracious Eminence, the Mayor, happily we have a very good one in Dordrecht, who will decide whether or not this document qualifies me to be exempt. Otherwise, I'm back to square one and I have to go and sit through a Life in the Netherlands course.
And this is what we're desperate to get fully involved in, a system which works like that. Well, whatever's going on with Belgium not accepting cash as legal tender, the Swiss are apparently getting a bit hot under the collar.
Yes, you've got here, the same copy exists in several Swiss journals. I don't know how that happens, but it's telling us that the federal president, Simonetta Sommaruga, received a tip-off from a foreign authority. It took a Japanese outlet to actually tell us that this was probably the CIA, or was the CIA. But the Swiss haven't said that. They've just said that they have received a tip-off. They've passed it on from the central federal government to the cantons, nearly 30 of them in Switzerland. And the key thing is that the federal president said there are no indications of any particular terrorist target. But we forwarded the stuff to the canton. She said they will have to verify it and take action. And it's one of the loosest and freest countries in the world, Switzerland, in some ways. But here you have it, you see, because of the terrorist threat, vague and undefined, we have to have close cooperation between the federal centre in Bern and the cantons, which jealously guard their independence. And I read in this article that even a youth procession, which was nearly banned, eventually took place under heightened security. So even in a mass armed country like Switzerland, it's quite frightening for these young people to go through the streets with presumably men with guns waving around near them. So I'm afraid Switzerland is being got at. Alex Jones says that they and the Americans, well, possibly you could say the Finns, they're the three countries in the world where the right to keep and bear arms is not infringed. And I suspect that's what's going on here, is that the Swiss are going to be struck off that list.
Right. Well, if that's the state in Switzerland, what is going on in this picture?
Yes. This is Yatsenyuk, better known to the plotters of the US State Department as Yats. He is the slight gentleman being hoisted into the air by his unmentionables. It's Russia Today, of course, which showed this clip with great glee. You'll see it all over the internet if you look for example, Rumble in the Rada, RADA, which is the Ukrainian parliament. He was telling Ukrainian MPs at this point basically that he didn't give a fig for opinion polls. His opinion poll rating is down to 2%, which means that the ethnic Ukrainian western half of the country has fallen out of love with him as well. He was installed by, as we covered on the UK column, Victoria Nuland of the US State Department and her husband Robert Kagan of the Project for a New American Century and other nasty types like that. And if you remember, the Russians released intercept of Nuland blithely saying, "We're going to install Yats as Prime Minister when this coup is pulled off." Well, there he is, this slight figure. And I have to tell you, after several visits to Ukraine, one thing that defines that country is the men are real men and the women are real women. That's really what makes Ukraine so different from the rest of Europe. And so at this point, martial arts experts among the ethnic Russian MPs had enough of this wittering on about, "I don't need popularity." The arrogant subtext was, "The Americans will back me whatever I do." And so he marches to the front and presents him, ironically, with a bunch of roses. Now, what's not said here in journalism, but I can tell you it's the case in Ukraine and Russia, is if you give a bloke a bunch of roses, that's not the same as doing it in France or the Netherlands, where it's a kind of cultured sign of appreciation. If you give a bloke a bunch of roses in a Slavic country, you're saying, "You're a woman. No, you are America's something that rhymes with glitch." That really is the message, especially because his handler was Nuland, a woman. So there he is, hoisted out of the tribunal where he's speaking by his unmentionables high into the air, and one of Ukraine's famous parliamentary brawls starts.
Well, fantastic. I know we've got lots of smiles about that, but the underlying events are, of course, really serious. And Estonia, which you're going to mention here, really emphasises this. I'm keeping a little bit of an eye on the time, Alex. You've got some excellent photographs you want to go through. If we don't get all of those done today, perhaps we might be able to invite you to be with us on Friday. I don't know what your programme is. We just organise schedules live on air. But first of all, let's have a look at this Estonia one.
Yes, this is the original Estonian version of a book called Memories Denied in English. The Estonian title is Tõrjutud mälestused. I've read both versions. The pictures are amazing. The point I wanted to make here is this. I got into a Twitter discussion this week with a gentleman who turned out to be very serious and motivated. I didn't get on with him well at first because he was saying the UK column is not saying enough about the communist threat and the Jewish angle. And I wanted to reply to people of that mindset now with a respectful request to please consider the case of Estonia. We can theorize about the Nazis versus the communists and what role the Jews had in all of it. The Baltic states and Poland, of course, lived through the hell of both sides. And this lady, whose mother is in that photograph there, Imbi Paju, is a very good Estonian journalist who has documented the loss of Estonian nationhood and even the national sense of consciousness through the Soviet side. But the point she makes throughout the book, you really must get the English version, which is available from Amazon, called Memories Denied, is that both sides, Nazis and communists, worked together, and the Jews suffered the most. Because before the war, the Jews in Estonia had a world first. They had a fully fledged autonomous regime for themselves throughout the country. They had a great flowering of life. And the Nazis and the Soviets dismantled that. And in the middle of the book, I'll read one paragraph. You have a quotation from Lennart Meri, who is this fantastically cultured president that Estonia had after independence. He gave a speech in 1999 in which he said this regarding the question of Nazis versus communists and is it a Jewish plot. He says, even though the soldiers of both totalitarian states wore different uniforms, they were in nature identical twins. Each learned from the other. Each developed with the support of the other. The repressive mechanisms were similar, each one developing on the foundation of the other's experience. It's no great difference whether the enemy was described as an Untermensch by the Nazis or by the Soviets as a representative of a hostile nation. That's what the Estonians were called. There's no difference whether the state economy was led by a state planning committee or by the Albert Speer committee. It is not a big difference whether the dictator is called Der Führer or Vozhd. That was Stalin's term. Learn from the Estonians' experience. They're only 1 million people. But we can learn so much from them to avoid misery for hundreds of millions of others in Europe. We can't react against the Marxist plots in Europe at the current day by falling into the arms of neo-Nazi rhetoric. It'll do no good, because both of these systems are both sides of the same coin, and Jews are the victims of both sides, not the perpetrators.
Alex, thank you very much for that. We know that these are subjects which people are very, very emotive about. There's a lot of information flowing around. My simple response is we've got to be very, very discerning as to who the bad guys are. And that famous phrase, by their fruits ye shall know them, is very, very powerful. Let's just end by thinking that as we watch this very, very devious EU super state unfold, perhaps we've only got to look at the labels on some of the buildings to understand just what's coming. And you photograph for us, I'm sorry I've labelled it over the top of the main bit. This is the Court of Audit. I presume this is in Brussels. What's the significance of this? We can highlight the key bit, which is not open to the public.
That's it. You're strolling through what's supposedly the nicest bit of Brussels, the Museum Quarter, and you suddenly come slap bang up against this Court of Audit. Is there any public building which ought to be more transparent than the Chamber of Audit, particularly the Supreme one? And instead of actually having a situation of being open to the public, we have people basically being told to get lost. And you've got a picture of the doors there, very shabby. I was talking about the very well kept Flemish community building. That belongs to a real community of people, a national community. This is part of the Belgian Federation. And like the EU above it, that doesn't belong to any nation. So it can be as unkempt as you like.
Yeah. And we might as well end on the next one, which is this particular building. And you'd spotted European Conference on e-passports. This is the sign on the building. And if we have a look at that in a bit of detail, your point here is, who are these people that are now going to who are going to control the movement of people across borders? Those borders don't exist, though, do they?
Well, this is interesting, isn't it? We've abolished borders, apparently, in the Schengen Agreement. And yet, if you look at the logos, you've got the Italian Interior Ministry, the Dutch IND, Immigration and Naturalization Department, a host of financial institutions, of high-tech people, lots of Scandinavians. Of course, they've got the interest, the technology and the money. It appears that borders have not been abolished. They've simply been dissolved at the national level, and they're going to be reinstated at the individual level, with all kinds of sophisticated ID cards.
And that is a frightening prospect when we know that ultimately the people who are controlling the political agenda are very dark and dangerous. On that point, we will end today's news. Alex, thank you very much for joining us. I'm sure there's going to be some debate going on in the chat room after we've finished. We will be back same time tomorrow. And as always, if you enjoy what the UK column is doing, we are trying to fight the political agenda that's unfolding very quickly now in UK and indeed in Europe. If you like what we're doing, please consider subscribing or making us a donation. And thank you very much to the people who sent us checks over the last few days. That was very kind of you and much appreciated. Thanks for joining us. We will see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.